Hello, church family. I'm here in my office and I'm standing in front of a framed sermon manuscript from about 130 years ago. This sermon was preached by Charles Spurgeon. You may know him. He was a famous pastor in London, and he had a pretty cool nickname too. He was called the Prince of Preachers. And more on Spurgeon in just a moment, but I first want to just share with you why I'm delivering this message to you today. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, the Apostle Paul tells us that our words have a purpose. And the purpose of our words is not to tear people down. The purpose of our words is not to corrupt situations. But instead, he says our words should be used to build others up. That our words should be fitting for each occasion. And when we do this, when we build people up and our words are fitting for an occasion, we're actually giving grace to those who receive our words, who hear us. What Paul's actually saying there is that we have a void, a built-in void, that maybe each day, maybe each week, maybe each month, we start out with this void that needs to be filled, that we are currently not built up all the time as we could be. And so what is needed is for words from other people to come along and to build us up and give grace as we hear. So that's my hope and my purpose for coming to you in this short video. I'm asking that God would use some words that I use today and maybe tomorrow and the day after that to build you up, to be a fitting word for a troubled time and give grace to you as you hear it. So I'm titling this short series that'll be doing some of these videos called Fitting Words for Troubled Times. We truly are in some troubled times. We need some fitting words so that we can have grace as we hear these words from the Lord. Okay, back to Charles Spurgeon. He shared a quote at a point in his life that's one of my favorite quotes from him, and I'll give you that quote in just a minute. But Charles Spurgeon, even at a very young age, had some pressures in life, pressures that none of us will ever face. He was just 22 years old. His fame was rising as he was becoming well known for his preaching. And he was asked to preach this one particular music hall in London. He was just 22 years old. The place was packed out in the evening. By estimates, they say there was over 10,000 people that had filled this music hall to hear him preach. And as he ascended the platform to begin his sermon, he hadn't even spoken a word yet. He was just getting ready to pray. And someone in the crowd jumped up and yelled, "Fire!" And because of that careless word, the people began to become terrified, and a stampede took place. And they ran out, and in their runnings out of this music hall, 7 people were actually trampled to death. And I just think back to that situation where Spurgeon, at 22 years old, having a weight on his shoulders of the deaths of these people, would have probably faced some very discouraging and troubled times. Of course, you may know Spurgeon was no stranger to fighting depression and being discouraged, but he always found hope in the grace of God. And in one particular time, he was meditating and preaching on 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, where God tells the Apostle Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." So Spurgeon, as he's riding home on his horse one night, which was the mode of transportation for him in those days, he began thinking about that verse, "My grace is sufficient for you." And here comes one of my favorite quotes, a timely word in times of trouble, a fitting word for us. He said this, he said, "God's grace is sufficient for me. It would be as if I was a small fish in the Thames River, and I was fearful, yet if I drank a little bit of water, that I would drink the river dry." But he said, "Oh, then the word of God comes to me and says, 'Drink up, little fish. My water is sufficient for you.'" He said, "Then I imagined that I might be a little mouse in the granaries of Egypt in the times of Joseph. And I was worried in some way, thinking that maybe if I ate some of the grain that I would exhaust its riches. And then a word from the Lord comes to me, "Eat up, little mouse. My granaries are sufficient for you." He said, lastly, I thought about a man climbing a tall mountain and wondering whether if in his bustling of climbing, in his exertion of energy, that he would somehow breathe and exhaust all of the air of the atmosphere. And he heard a word from the Lord say, "Breathe, O man, breathe up. My atmosphere is sufficient for you." I hope that a fitting word for you today is to hear that God's grace is sufficient. It's a fitting word even in troubled times. May we hear today that in the uncertainty of our times, in the disruption of our normal schedules and daily life, that God's grace is sufficient for you. Drink up, little fish. Eat up, little mouse. Breathe and fill your lungs, O man or woman. God's grace is sufficient. And I wonder if you have a verse or a quote or even a testimony of God's sufficient grace for you in your life. Would you share that in the comments? Let others hear your words, be built up in a fitting time, and give grace to them to hear. Thank you for spending a couple of minutes with me here. I hope to post some more of these in the days to come. But for now, I bid you a grace-filled day. Thank you.